The year was 1940. The world was on fire. Europe had fallen under the crushing weight of Nazi Germany, and across the globe, shadows stretched eastward. In Indochina, France, once the proud colonial master, was broken and humiliated, its authority fractured by defeat. And in that moment of collapse, an old enemy stirred. From Bangkok, the Siamese generals looked east. To them, Cambodia's western provinces Battambang and Siem Reap were not French territories, nor Khmer homelands, but stolen lands waiting to be reclaimed. Japan, rising like a storm in the Pacific, promised them a chance: strike while France is weak, and redraw the map. By December 1940, the guns thundered. Thai planes bombed Cambodian towns, shells ripped through pagodas, and villages burned in the shadow of Angkor. For the Khmer people, it was not a war of kings or empires, it was another nightmare of foreign ambitions carving their homeland to pieces. This is not just a story of lost borders, it is the story of Cambodia caught between collapsing France, ambitious Siam, and the rising empire of Japan. It is a story of fire, betrayal, and a silence that still haunts the ruins of Battambang and Siem Reap. The Forgotten War begins. Part 1. The Burning Frontier. The dry season of 1940 settled heavily upon the plains of Cambodia. The rice fields shimmered under the sun, cracked in places from the relentless heat, while the Mekong flowed on in its eternal rhythm, carrying with it the whispers of empire and conquest. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, a storm was gathering. Cambodia, already under the suffocating hand of French colonial rule, was about to become the battleground of foreign powers once again. Stage 4 ambitions that cared little for the lives of Khmer peasants or the sanctity of ancient lands. The Franco-Thai War of 1940–41 is often remembered in maps and treaties, in lines redrawn by colonial diplomats. But for those who lived through it, it was not about geography. It was about the sudden roar of engines overhead, the crack of artillery where monks once chanted, the sight of flames swallowing villages that had stood for generations, the collapse of France and the rise of opportunity. The spark that ignited this war lay far from Indochina, in the heart of Europe. In June 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany in a matter of weeks. The proud colonial empire, which had projected strength and dominance across Africa and Asia, was suddenly fractured and humiliated. The colonial authorities in Indochina, the protectorate, that included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, were now cut off from Paris, forced to govern under the weakened shadow of Vichy France, a puppet regime collaborating with Germany. In Bangkok, the Siamese government, under Prime Minister Field Marshal Plaek Phibinsson Kramnon, simply as Phibin saw this collapse, not as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. Siam had long harbored grievances against France for seizing Laos and western Cambodia in the late 19th century, lands the Siamese rulers claimed as their own. Battambang and Siem Reap in particular remained scars on Siam's national memory. For decades, the Khmer provinces had been absorbed into the French colonial map, but in Thai schools and propaganda, they were described as lost territories to be reclaimed when the time was right. Now, with France defeated and weak, Phibin's generals argued that the time had come. The dream of restoring Siam's former glory could be achieved, and Japan, already spreading its influence across Southeast Asia, seemed willing to support Siam's claim. Tokyo, eager to weaken France's hold and expand its own sphere of control, promised backing if Bangkok struck first. And so, Siam's eyes turned once more toward Cambodia. The first flames. In December 1940, Thai forces launched their invasion. The attacks began with air raids across western Cambodia. Bombers roared low over the rice fields of Battambang, their shadows racing across the ground like harbingers of death. Villagers, unprepared and defenseless, could only scatter as explosives rained down on pagodas, markets, and wooden homes. For many Khmer peasants, this was the first time they had ever seen an airplane, not as a marvel, but as a machine of terror. French forces in Cambodia, composed largely of colonial troops, Vietnamese, territorials, a handful of European officers, and hastily armed local militias, struggled to mount a defense. They were undermanned, poorly supplied, and cut off from reinforcements by the turmoil in Europe. The French administrators in Phnom Penh issued proclamations of loyalty and defiance, but in reality, their power was fragile. Their grip on Cambodia had always been enforced more through bureaucracy and intimidation than true military strength. The Khmer people themselves were caught in the middle. Too many peasants, it mattered little whether their overlords were French or Siamese. The burden of war fell on their shoulders all the same. Yet in the ancient heartlands of Angkor, there was a bitter irony. The temples of Siem Reap, once the seat of a mighty Khmer empire, now became pawns in a war between outsiders. The stones of Angkor Wat, which had withstood centuries of time, now watched silently as bombs echoed across the horizon. Siam's strategy. Phiban and his generals knew that France, weakened and humiliated in Europe, could not withstand a determined assault in Indochina. Siamese forces pushed across the frontier with confidence, supported by Japanese encouragement. The strategy was swift and brutal. Seize Cambodia's western provinces, overwhelm the scattered French garrisons, and present the occupation as a fait accompli to the international community. On the ground, Thai soldiers marched into Battambang and Siem Reap with banners flying. Propaganda declared them liberators reclaiming stolen lands. In Bangkok, newspapers carried triumphant headlines, hailing the return of ancient provinces to the Thai crown. But in Cambodia, the reality was far darker. Khmer villagers, already burdened by French taxation and forced labor, now found themselves under the heel of another foreign army. Looting and violence followed in the wake of occupation. Families were torn from their homes. Monks fled monasteries, and centuries-old pagodas were desecrated by shells and boots. The French attempted counterattacks, but they were outmatched. In one particularly bloody engagement at Yang Dankum in January 1941, French colonial troops clashed fiercely with Siamese forces. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and the Cambodian countryside was left littered with corpses. Survivors would later recall fields where the smell of death lingered for weeks, where birds no longer sang, and where farmers dared not return to their work. Japan's shadow, hovering over the war, was the shadow of Japan. Officially, Tokyo positioned itself as a mediator, presenting itself as a neutral arbiter between Siam and France. In reality, Japan encouraged Siam's aggression, calculating that a weakened French presence in Indochina would make it easier for Japan to dominate the region. By early 1941, Japanese diplomats stepped in to broker a ceasefire, but their mediation was not for peace, it was to strengthen Japan's hand. When the armistice was signed in January 1941, Siam retained control of Battambang and Siem Reap, while France was forced to swallow yet another humiliation. Cambodia had been carved up once more, not by its own will, but by the games of empires. The Khmer silence. For the Cambodian people, the Franco-Thai War was not a story of glorious battles or noble causes. It was a story of silence, of helplessness, of being trampled under the boots of others. Neither France nor Siam fought for the Khmer nation. They fought for pride, for revenge, for imperial ambition. In Battambang and Siem Reap, families lived in fear under new masters. Khmer nobles who had collaborated with the French were now accused of treachery by Siamese occupiers, while others quickly shifted allegiance in order to survive. Ordinary villagers bore the brunt of taxation, forced requisitions, and the ever-present terror of war. In Phnom Penh, the royal court under King Sisawath Monavon watched in anguish. The Cambodian monarch, a figurehead under French domination, had little power to intervene. The war demonstrated with brutal clarity how little sovereignty remained to Cambodia. Once the seat of a mighty empire, the kingdom was now nothing more than a pawn, its fate decided by foreign capitals, a frontier in flames. By mid-1941, the war formally ended, but the frontier remained scarred. Villages in Battambang still smoldered. Pagodas stood in ruins, their gilded Buddhas blackened by fire. Survivors whispered of atrocities committed by both sides, of families executed on suspicion of collaboration, of monks dragged from their shrines. The war had lasted barely 2 months, but its consequences would echo for decades. For Siam, it was a temporary triumph, a reclamation of lost pride under Japan's shadow. For France, it was a humiliation that underscored its vulnerability. For Cambodia, it was yet another chapter in a long history of suffering, a reminder that the ghosts of Angkor still watched a kingdom stripped of power, waiting for the day its people could rise again. And as the guns fell silent, one truth remained. The frontier was burning, and Cambodia was trapped in the fire. Part 2. Shadows of Occupation. The war did not begin with thunder, but with whispers that grew into storms. Along Cambodia's western frontier, villagers who had tilled their rice fields for generations suddenly found themselves staring across a line of fire. Thai troops crossed the border under banners of liberation, their commanders speaking of lost provinces and national pride. Yet for the people who lived there, no liberation came, only fear, confusion, and death. Battambang, fertile jewel of Cambodia, and Siem Reap, sacred guardian of Angkor, were once more caught in the jaws of foreign ambition. By December 1940, Thai forces moved with precision. Their army, reformed along Japanese models, was modernized compared to the scattered French colonial garrisons. Tanks rumbled across dusty tracks where ox carts once passed. Thai aircraft screamed over pagodas and rice fields, dropping bombs that sent families fleeing into forests. Villagers, dressed in nothing more than worn sarongs, carried bundles on their backs, monks' robes, palm leaf manuscripts, a few handfuls of rice, everything they could salvage before fire consumed their homes. The French, weakened and humiliated after Nazi Germany's swift conquest of France, held Cambodia through the Vichy regime, loyal to a government collaborating with Hitler. Yet even in weakness, France refused to yield Cambodia easily. Colonial officers rallied their mixed forces. French Marines, North African troops, and Cambodian conscripts pressed into service. They dug trenches along the Mekong, knowing they were outnumbered, but bound by pride and duty. To the Cambodians wearing French uniforms, it was a bitter irony to fight and die for the very power that had stolen their sovereignty, even as a neighbor came promising to free their land. Skirmishes turned to pitched battles. Along the border near Sisaphon, artillery roared. French guns, relics from the Great War, fired clumsily against Thai columns advancing with Japanese-supplied weapons. The ground shook, not only from shells, but from the cries of families fleeing. A generation earlier, Battambang had tasted Siamese rule, returned to Cambodia only in 1907. Now it was under assault again. Old men whispered that history was repeating itself, that the spirits of the land were angry, that Cambodia's fate was forever to be carved by other hands. The most dramatic clash unfolded not on land but at sea. In January 1941, the French Navy engaged the Thai fleet near Ko Chang. The battle was savage and brief. French gunners, manning antiquated but deadly warships, sank several Thai vessels, striking a rare victory. For a moment, Cambodian hopes flickered. Perhaps France could still hold the line, but the triumph meant little. Japan, looming in the shadows, had already decided the war's outcome. Japan presented itself as mediator, cloaked in the rhetoric of Asian brotherhood. In truth, Tokyo had no interest in Cambodian freedom or French dignity. It sought to keep Thailand close as an ally, while weakening France to clear its path across Indochina. To the Cambodians themselves, Japan's promises were empty words carried on foreign winds. Soldiers bearing the rising sun flag were less liberators than executioners, ensuring that the weak would remain divided while the strong feasted on their lands. Under Thai occupation, Battambang and Siem Reap sank into darkness. Thai soldiers marched into cities with banners proclaiming the reunion of lost provinces. In Bangkok, parades celebrated the recovery of national honor. But in the streets of Battambang, Khmer families were forced to bow before Thai administrators. Schools replaced Khmer language with Thai. Monks were ordered to recite prayers in unfamiliar accents. Ancient pagodas, once safe havens, were Some monks fled into forests, carrying sacred statues on their shoulders to hide them from looting. Others were beaten when they refused to comply. The humiliation of cultural erasure cut deeper than bullets. Everywhere lay the mark of occupation. Cambodian peasants were pressed into forced labor, digging roads for Thai convoys, cutting timber for export, hauling supplies under the lash of bayonets. Women, left alone when men were conscripted or killed, endured harassment from occupying troops. In village after village, stories spread of disappearances, sons taken away in trucks, never to be seen again. Daughters violated in silence. Few dared to speak, for silence was safer than defiance. The refugee trails grew thick with suffering. Families trudged eastward, abandoning ancestral homes. Children carried younger siblings on their backs, barefoot, on sharp gravel, their bellies hollow from hunger. Old men collapsed by the roadside, left behind with whispered prayers. The Mekong River, lifeline of Cambodia, became a boundary between despair and a fragile hope. Yet even there, Thai patrols prowled, and French officials screened refugees with suspicion, fearing spies. The Cambodians were trapped between a conqueror who claimed to be liberator and a colonial master who offered only chains. In Phnom Penh, rumors spread like wildfire. Mothers wept at the thought of daughters in Battambang, cut off behind enemy lines. The capital trembled under blackout drills, fearing Thai air raids. French propaganda posters proclaimed resistance, but in the tea shops, Cambodians muttered bitterly, "Who fights for us? France, Thailand, Japan. All of them treat us like pawns, and we alone bear the blood price." The Japanese hand grew heavier as months passed. Though officially neutral, their troops moved deeper into Indochina, using Cambodia's railways and ports to tighten control. They assured Thai generals that victory was near, while whispering to Vichy officers that France would not lose everything so long as it obeyed Tokyo. It was a game of puppeteers. Strings pulled across borders, and Cambodia dangled helpless at the center. By early 1941, the end came not with a final battle but with a pen stroke. Japan summoned both France and Thailand to negotiations, dictating terms that served only itself. Cambodia had no voice at the table. Its land was divided without its consent. Battambang and Siem Reap were handed to Thailand as trophies, and the war was declared settled. For Cambodians, the settlement was nothing more than another betrayal carved into memory. Yet the suffering did not end with peace. Under Thai rule, life hardened, taxes rose, fields were seized. Khmer farmers found themselves tenants on their own soil. Markets filled with Thai officials who enriched themselves while locals starved. The Khmer language was banned from government offices, and Thai textbooks flooded classrooms. Children learned to call their hometowns by foreign names, their own history erased before their eyes. Still, resistance simmered. In remote villages, monks told forbidden stories of Angkor, reminding children that their ancestors once built empires greater than any who now trampled them. Secret prayers were offered at night, candles lit before hidden statues of Jayavarman and Angkor Wat, symbols of endurance in a time of darkness. Some young men fled to forests, joining guerrilla bands that harassed Thai patrols, though their rifles were few and their lives short. The occupation was not merely territorial, it was a war against the soul of Cambodia. For ordinary people, survival became the only form of resistance. Mothers passed down Khmer lullabies in whispers, ensuring their children remembered who they were. Farmers carved patterns of Naga and Apsara into wooden tools, defying erasure with every stroke. Even as Thai propaganda blared from loudspeakers, the people clung to fragments of their identity, like treasures hidden in plain sight. The Franco-Thai War was short in the annals of global conflict, a sideshow compared to the vast carnage of World War II. But for Cambodia, its shadows lingered long after the guns fell silent. It revealed the cruel reality of small nations trapped between great powers, their lands carved like meat at a feast. For the peasants of Battambang and Siem Reap, it was not a war of strategy or diplomacy. It was the tearing away of homes, the silence of lost voices, the memory of temples defiled. When Japan announced its victory as mediator, Bangkok cheered, Paris grumbled, Tokyo smiled on, Cambodia bled in silence. The human cost was measured not in treaties but in the faces of refugees, the broken lines of families, the vanished songs of monks. Occupation had returned, and with it, the cruel reminder that Cambodia's fate was not her own to decide. And so the shadows deepened. Part 3. The Forgotten Victors. When the guns fell silent along the Cambodian frontier in early 1941, it was not because the war had run its natural course, but because Japan decreed it so. In Bangkok, crowds roared with pride at parades, celebrating recovered provinces. Thai newspapers proclaimed the end of humiliation, calling Battambang and Siem Reap once more the heart of the nation. In Paris, the Vichy regime gritted its teeth, forced to sign away territories it had promised to defend. In Tokyo, diplomats smiled, their empire's influence deepening across Southeast Asia. And in Cambodia, the people, those who had lost their homes, their families, their dignity, remained silent, their voices erased from the record. The Tokyo Agreement of May 1941 drew neat lines on a map. Battambang and Siem Reap, along with parts of Laos, were ceded to Thailand. The act was framed as restoring balance and ensuring peace in Asia, yet in truth, it was the price of survival. Vichy France, stripped of power in Europe, could not afford another front. Thailand, emboldened by Japan's patronage, accepted its prize. Japan tightened its hold on Indochina, stationing more troops, securing roads, and using Cambodia as a pawn in its grand design. but no Cambodian official, no monk, no villager, no elder was invited to that table. The very people whose soil was being traded were absent from the room. For Thailand, the victory was intoxicating. Streets in Bangkok echoed with chants of nationalism. School children memorized new maps where the lost provinces were shaded once again in the colors of the Thai kingdom. Field Marshal Phibun Songkhram basked in the glory. His portrait hung in classrooms and government offices. For France, the loss was humiliating, yet it masked itself with rhetoric of temporary compromise, promising its colonial subjects that one day order would return. For Cambodia, there was nothing but silence. Under Thai rule, Battambang and Siem Reap entered a shadowed chapter that lasted until 1946. At first, there was hope among some locals that perhaps life would improve, that Thai rulers, sharing a closer cultural bond than the distant French, might treat Cambodians more kindly. But reality soon crushed those illusions. Administrators arrived from Bangkok, speaking in official tones, demanding obedience. Khmer language disappeared from schools and courts, replaced by Thai decrees. Ancient pagodas saw their sermons rewritten, as monks were pressured to adopt Thai liturgical practices. Markets filled with officials and soldiers who treated locals as inferior subjects, not brothers. The weight of assimilation fell heavy on every household. Even names were stripped. Towns and villages were renamed with Thai words. Children were forced to recite oaths of loyalty to a king they had never seen, in a tongue not their own. Families who resisted risked punishment. Some were fined, others were beaten. A handful of outspoken monks were arrested for sedition, accused of spreading Khmer separatist sentiment. To speak one's language became an act of quiet rebellion. The human toll did not end with language. Taxes rose sharply, squeezing farmers already battered by war. Rice, the lifeblood of Cambodian villages, was seized to feed Thai garrisons. Fields lay fallow as men were conscripted into labor, building roads and barracks for their occupiers. Women carried the burden of entire households, scraping together what little remained. Starvation haunted the countryside. In whispered conversations, peasants began to say they had merely traded one master for another. But the lash of assimilation cut deeper than the colonial whip. France had ruled them as subordinates, but Thailand sought to erase them entirely. Japan, meanwhile, tightened its grip over both sides. Its troops spread across Indochina, securing ports, railways, and airfields. They presented themselves as arbiters, but in reality, they drained Cambodia of resources for their war machine. Japanese officers promised respect for Cambodian traditions, yet their soldiers seized rice and timber with impunity. The French colonial authorities, now reduced to puppets, coexisted uneasily with the Japanese. To Cambodian eyes, it was a theater of shadows, foreign powers fighting over their land, while the true owners were trampled beneath. In Phnom Penh, despair mingled with quiet rage. Intellectuals and monks who dared to speak against the occupation were silenced. Newspapers, censored first by France and then by Japan, printed only propaganda. Families in the capital waited for news of relatives trapped in Battambang or Siem Reap, but letters rarely came. When they did, they told of hardship and erasure. A woman wrote to her cousin in Phnom Penh, "They make our children write our names in a language not ours. They tell us to pray in words we do not know. When I speak Khmer in the market, the soldiers laugh. They say, we are not a people, only a province to be corrected." Such testimonies, scattered and fragile, are the only remnants of countless lives lived under occupation. By 1944, the tides of war shifted. Japan's empire, once invincible, began to crumble under Allied blows. Bombs fell across Southeast Asia, disrupting trade and supply lines. Thailand, sensing danger, attempted to distance itself from Japan, but the stain of collaboration ran deep. France, weakened but not broken, maneuvered to reclaim its colonial grip. Once again, Cambodia found itself at the mercy of others' struggles. The collapse of Japan in 1945 reshaped the world. In Europe, liberation restored France's pride. In Asia, old colonies stirred with new dreams of independence. But for Cambodia, the return of Battambang and Siem Reap in 1946 came not through its own strength, but through the shifting deals of empires. France reclaimed the provinces, reinstating the boundaries of 1907. Cambodian officials traveled to the west to reassert authority, greeted by weary villagers who had endured 5 years of suppression. Thai administrators departed reluctantly, leaving behind resentment and scars. For Thailand, the loss was bitter, its brief triumph undone by global defeat. For France, it was a symbolic restoration, a way to proclaim that its empire still stood. But for Cambodians, it was a hollow return. Yes, the land was once again theirs, but the suffering had already been endured, the wounds carved deep. The fields of Battambang bore the traces of forced labor. The temples of Siem Reap remembered the footsteps of foreign soldiers. Families who had buried loved ones could not bring them back with treaties. The victors celebrated, but the true cost was paid by those who had never asked for war. The war left invisible scars as well. Cambodia's sense of identity was shaken. To be Khmer in those years meant to resist erasure quietly, to endure humiliation with patience. The occupation became a lesson etched into memory, that survival for small nations often meant swallowing pride, bending to storms, waiting for them to pass. But it also planted seeds of determination. Young Cambodians who witnessed their parents' humiliation, who saw their temples defiled, and their language forbidden, carried those memories into the decades that followed. When the cry for independence finally rose in the 1950s, it carried with it the ghosts of Battambang and Siem Reap under occupation. Yet history books rarely speak of Cambodia's suffering during the Franco-Thai War. It is overshadowed by larger battles, by the vast canvas of World War II. In Western narratives, it is a footnote. In Thai accounts, a moment of triumph. In French records, an embarrassing compromise. But for the Cambodian people, it was a lived nightmare, a shadow that stretched across generations. The forgotten victors were not the generals, nor the diplomats, nor the nations that drew lines on maps. The true victors were the survivors, the farmers who tilled their soil under foreign bayonets, the monks who whispered forbidden prayers, the mothers who kept the Khmer tongue alive in their children's ears. When Battambang and Siem Reap returned to Cambodia, there were no grand parades, no roaring celebrations. Instead, there was quiet relief, mingled with mourning. The land was theirs again, but at what cost? The rivers had carried too many bodies. The pagodas had heard too many cries. For those who had lived through it, the return felt less like victory than survival. As the 1940s closed, Cambodia stood at a crossroads. The French had reclaimed their colony, but their grip was weakened. The memory of occupation by both Thailand and Japan lingered, teaching Cambodians that foreign powers could no longer be trusted to protect them. Independence loomed on the horizon, fueled by wounds that refused to heal. The Franco-Thai War is remembered by few outside the region, dismissed as a minor border conflict, but in its shadows lie truths about empire, ambition, and the price paid by the innocent. It was not a war of heroes and villains, but of pawns moved across a chessboard they did not own. And in that game, Cambodia endured yet again the cruelty of being small in a world ruled by giants. The forgotten victors were the people who survived, not because they won battles, not because they signed treaties, but because they endured. They whispered their language when it was banned. They lit candles before statues when their temples were defiled. They passed down their stories in the dark so that their children would remember. Against erasure, they carved memory. Against silence, they preserved song. Against occupation, they kept alive the fragile flame of being Khmer in the end. When the maps were redrawn and the armies withdrew, Cambodia remained scarred, weary but unbroken. The shadows of occupation lingered, but so too did the resilience of a people who refused to vanish. And so, in the forgotten corners of history, the true victors were not the empires that fought, but the Cambodians who endured them. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history videos.